What happens when a billionaire's arrogance meets a truth he cannot buy? In an upscale restaurant where power brokers dine, one elderly water seller became the mirror that shattered everything three wealthy men thought they knew. This is the story of a challenge that started as mockery, transformed into revelation, and ended in a silence louder than any fortune could speak. The Celestial Pearl was not the kind of restaurant where ordinary people dined. Nestled on the 42nd floor of Manhattan's Apex Tower, it demanded reservations 6 months in advance, charged more for a single appetizer than most families spent on groceries in a week, and maintained an atmosphere of hushed elegance where even whispers felt like intrusions. Rain streaked down the floor-to-ceiling windows on this October evening, turning the city below into an impressionist painting of lights and motion. Inside, beneath the glow of Murano glass chandeliers, the elite of New York conducted the quiet business of being wealthy. At a corner table with the best view of the glittering skyline sat 3 men who commanded attention without demanding it. Their table was always reserved, always waiting, always perfect. Edward Ashford sat at the head, his silver cufflinks catching the light as he gestured with a wine glass. At 52, Edward had built a financial empire that spanned 4 continents. His tailored Tom Ford suit, his platinum Patek Philippe watch, his perfectly coiffed dark hair with distinguished grey at the temples, everything about him announced success without vulgarity. He had the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. To his right sat Linus Chen, 47, angular and intense, his dark eyes missing nothing. A tech magnate who'd revolutionized artificial intelligence and machine learning, Linus wore his wealth more casually. Designer jeans, a black turtleneck that cost more than it looked, titanium-framed glasses that were actually advanced AR displays. He'd been featured on the cover of Wired magazine 17 times, and to Edward's left, in a crisp white thobe that seemed to glow against the restaurant's dim lighting, sat Musala al-Rahman. At 49, Musala was oil royalty, educated at Oxford, sophisticated and sharp with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that sparkled with perpetual amusement. He'd diversified his family's fortune into tech, real estate and renewable energy, proving he was more than just inherited wealth. They met here once a month, these 3 titans of industry, not to conduct business but to remind each other, and perhaps themselves, that they'd ascended to a realm beyond ordinary concern. "Gentlemen," Edward said, raising his glass of Chateau Petrus, "I propose a toast. To another quarter of unprecedented growth, to the fools who bet against us, and to the immutable law that has never failed us. Everything, and I mean everything, has a price." Linus and Musala raised their glasses, the crystal chiming softly as they touched. "Everything," Linus echoed with a slight smile. "Though I sometimes wonder if you actually believe that, Edward, or if it's just become your favorite aphorism." "I believe it because I've proven it," Edward replied, taking a slow sip. "Name one thing I haven't been able to acquire when I've truly wanted it." "Humility," Musala suggested with a grin. The table erupted in laughter, the easy, comfortable laughter of men who could afford to mock each other because their friendship was one of the few things their money hadn't bought, but had merely facilitated. "Touché, my friend," Edward conceded. "But seriously, think about it. Last month, I convinced Senator Morrison to support our infrastructure bill, something he'd publicly opposed for 2 years. The month before, I acquired the patent for Chen Industries' quantum encryption protocol." "You didn't acquire it," Linus interjected. "You licensed it. There's a difference." "Semantics," Edward waved dismissively. "I got what I wanted." "That's the point. In our world, desire plus capital equals acquisition. It's mathematics." Musala leaned back in his chair, his white thobe rustling softly. "You know, Edward, in my culture, there's an old saying. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. Einstein said that." "Actually," Linus corrected gently. "Did he?" "Well, wise man, wherever he's from." Musala laughed. "The point stands. Some things exist outside your equations, Edward." "Name one," Edward challenged, his eyes gleaming with competitive fire. This was the game they played, had played for years. Intellectual chess disguised as dinner conversation. Before Musala could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. The maitre d', usually the picture of unflappable composure, was engaged in what appeared to be a tense, whispered conversation with an elderly man, The old man was perhaps 60, maybe older. It was hard to tell. He had a weathered face that suggested a life lived outdoors, not in climate-controlled boardrooms. His hair, white as fresh snow, was neatly combed but thinning, and his clothes, while clean, were simple. Worn khaki pants, a white button-down shirt that had seen better days, and a faded blue vest with multiple pockets. Most notably, he carried a large canvas bag over his shoulder, and from it protruded several bottles of water. "Absolutely not," they heard the maitre d' hiss. "This is a five-star establishment. You cannot solicit our guests." "I'm not soliciting," the old man replied, his voice carrying a strange dignity despite his obvious lower station. His English was clear but accented, Middle Eastern perhaps, or Mediterranean. "I'm offering." "There's a difference." "There is no difference here," the maitre d' insisted, moving to physically block the old man from entering further. "Please leave before I call security." Edward watched this interaction with the detached interest of someone watching theatre. But something about the old man intrigued him. The straight back, the calm eyes, the absolute lack of shame or desperation despite his obvious poverty. "Hassan," Edward called to the maitre d', his voice cutting across the restaurant with casual authority. "Let him through." Hassan turned, surprise flickering across his professional mask. "Mr. Ashford, I assure you this is unnecessary." "I said let him through," Edward repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. The maitre d' stepped aside, and the old man walked into the restaurant with measured steps. He didn't hurry, didn't shuffle apologetically. He walked like a man who had every right to be there, even though they all knew he didn't. Up close, Edward could see more details. The old man's face was deeply lined, particularly around the eyes, as if he'd spent a lifetime squinting at distant horizons. His hands, gripping the strap of his canvas bag, were calloused and scarred working hands. But his eyes were remarkable, clear, calm, and utterly unimpressed by his surroundings. "You sell water," Edward observed, gesturing to the bag. "I offer water," the old man corrected gently, his accent more pronounced now. "Selling implies I require the transaction. I merely present the opportunity." Linus leaned forward, intrigued. "That's an interesting distinction. You're a street vendor?" "I am a man with water and people with thirst," the old man replied simply. Musala laughed, delighted. "A philosopher." "Edward, you've invited a philosopher to our capitalist symposium." The old man's eyes shifted to Musala, and something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, perhaps or shared cultural understanding. "So you are Arab," the old man stated. It wasn't a question. "I am," Musala confirmed. "Kuwait originally, though I've spent more years in London and New York than in the Gulf. And you?" "Many places," the old man said. "But yes, I speak Arabic among other languages." "Fascinating," Edward interjected, his mind already spinning with possibilities. He'd had his fourth glass of wine, and the evening had taken on that pleasant edge where ideas felt brilliant and consequences distant. "Tell me, old man, what's your name?" "Does it matter?" the man asked. "Humour me." "Yusuf," the old man said after a pause. "My name is Yusuf." "Well, Yusuf, how much do you charge for your water?" Yusuf tilted his head, considering. "I ask for what people are willing to give. Some pay nothing. Some pay more than the water is worth." "Nothing has intrinsic worth," Linus said, unable to help himself. It was a topic he'd written papers on. "Value is purely a function of supply, demand, and perceived utility." "Is it?" Yusuf asked, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a naive question, but a challenge. Edward felt that familiar thrill, the one he got when negotiating a difficult deal or outmaneuvering a competitor. An idea was forming, audacious and perfect. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to Linus and Musala, "I believe we've found our test case." "What do you mean?" Linus asked, though he was already smiling. He knew that look on Edward's face. "Our debate. About whether everything can be bought, whether everything has a price." Edward turned back to Yusuf. "Tell me, old man, how many bottles do you have in that bag?" "8, Yusuf replied. "And how many have you sold tonight?" "None. None. On a rainy night in Manhattan, you've sold no water." Edward's voice carried mock surprise but real satisfaction. "That must be disappointing." "I am not disappointed," Yusuf said calmly. "The night is not over." Edward smiled, the smile of a predator who'd spotted prey. "Indeed it's not. In fact, I'm going to make you an offer that will transform your evening." He pulled out his phone, opened his banking app with theatrical flair, and set it on the table where everyone could see the balance, a number so large it seemed almost obscene in its excess. I'm going to give you an opportunity. Yusuf, I want you to sell me one bottle of your water. Just one, but there's a catch. The restaurant had grown quieter. Other diners were watching now, sensing drama. You must sell it to me in Arabic, Edward continued, his voice growing stronger, more commanding. Only in Arabic. You cannot use English or any language I understand. You must convince me, truly convince me, that I need this water, that I want to buy it, using only words I cannot comprehend. Make me understand value without understanding your words. He paused, letting the challenge sink in. Do this successfully, and I will pay you $100,000. Right here, right now, transferred to whatever account you have. The restaurant erupted in whispers. Even Hassan, the maitre d', had stopped pretending not to listen. Linus whistled softly. Edward, that's ridiculous, is it? Edward challenged. You said everything has contextual value. I'm testing whether value can transcend context, whether meaning can exist without understanding. This is pure philosophy meeting pure capitalism. How often do we get to conduct such an experiment? Musala was watching Yusuf carefully, his expression unreadable. And if he fails? If he fails, he admits that some transactions require mutual understanding. That value cannot exist in a vacuum, that my original premise is correct. Everything has a price, but that price requires comprehension. Edward turned back to Yusuf. What do you say, old man? $100,000 to sell me water, in a language I don't speak. Surely that's an opportunity you can't refuse. Yusuf stood very still, his weathered hands resting on his canvas bag. The entire restaurant waited for his response. $100,000 is more money than I have seen in my life, Yusuf said slowly. But you are not offering me an opportunity, Mr. Ashford. Edward Ashford. Mr. Ashford, you are not offering me an opportunity. You are offering yourself one. Edward blinked, thrown off balance for the first time. What do you mean? How you want to prove something, Yusuf said simply. Not to me. To yourself, perhaps, or to your friends. This challenge is not about the water or about money, or even about language. It is about you needing to be right. Perceptive, Linus murmured. But yes, Yusuf continued, I will accept your challenge, not for the money, though I will not refuse it if earned, but because I think you need to hear what I have to say, even if you do not understand the words. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a single bottle of water, not fancy, not imported, just a clear plastic bottle filled with clear liquid, the kind you could buy at any corner store for $1. Edward leaned back in his chair, wine glass in hand, supremely confident. Then please, Yusuf, sell me this water. Convince me I need it. Make me want to buy it. In Arabic. Yusuf held the bottle up to the light of the chandelier above, and the refracted light cast dancing patterns across the white linen tablecloth. Then he began to speak, his voice transformed. The Arabic flowed from him like water itself, liquid and ancient, rhythmic and profound. Though Edward, Linus, and the other diners couldn't understand the words, they found themselves leaning in, listening with an intensity that surprised them. But Musala understood every word. Fil badi' kan al-ma, Yusuf began, his voice soft but commanding. Qabla an yakun al-malu, qabla an takun al-quwa, qabla an yakun al-sharaf kan al-ma. In the beginning was water. Before there was money, before there was power, before there was honor, there was water. Musala's expression changed, subtle but noticeable to those who knew him. His eyes fixed on Yusuf with sudden intensity. Hadha laysa ma'an tastatu'u an tashtarhi faldukan, Yusuf continued, turning the bottle slowly, letting the light play through it. هذا هو أول ما شربه أبوك حين ولد. هذا هو آخر ما تلابث أمك قبل أن تفارق هذه الدنيا. This is not water you can buy in a store. This is the first thing your father drank when he was born. This is the last thing your mother asked for before she left this world. Edward watched, uncomprehending but fascinated, as Yusuf's hands moved through the air, painting invisible pictures. But he also watched Musala, whose face had gone very still, very pale beneath his olive complexion. Tara fahad al-ma wajhabanika, Yusuf said, his voice growing stronger, more passionate. Al-ibnu alladhi la ta'rifu kayfa yatahaddathu ilayhi ba'dalan. Al-ibnu alladhi yahtaju ila abihi, wa la yajidu illa rajulan mashghulan. You see in this water the face of your son, the son you no longer know how to talk to, the son who needs his father and finds only a busy man. Musala's hand, which had been resting on the table, clenched into a fist. His son, Rashid, 17 years old, brilliant and lost, had barely spoken to him in months. They lived in the same penthouse and existed in different worlds. Wal-yawma, Yusef continued, relentless and gentle all at once. Tastat u an tashtar alafa zujajatin min hadha al-ma. Tastat u an tamla barkan bihi. Tastat u an tusqiya tashaka bil-kira. And today you can buy 1,000 bottles of this water. You can fill a pool with it. You can quench your thirst with your pride. He paused, and in that pause the only sound was the rain against the windows, drumming its ancient rhythm. وَلَكِنْ هَلْ تَسْتَطِيعُ أَن تَجْعَلَ قَلْبَكَ يَشْتَرِهِ. But can you make your heart buy it? Edward glanced at Musala and was startled to see tears streaming down his friend's face. Musala made no sound. No movement to wipe them away. They simply fell, silent and devastating. What's he saying? Edward demanded. Musala, what is he saying? But Musala couldn't speak. His throat worked, but no words came. Yusef turned his attention to Linus, and though he continued speaking in Arabic, something in his gaze made it clear he was now addressing the tech mogul. Anta banita alamaka min al-adhka al-istina'i, Yusef said. وَنَسُوتَ أَنَّ الْمَعَ لَيْسَ ذَكِيًّا وَلَيْسَ غَبِيًا. هُوَ فَقَاتِمَا وَهَذَا كَيْنَ يَكْفَ. You built your world from artificial intelligence, and you forgot that water is not intelligent and not stupid. It is simply water, and this simplicity is enough. Linus, who had built his empire on complexity, on algorithms so sophisticated they seemed like magic, felt something shift in his chest. When was the last time something simple had been enough for him? Al-ma'ula yahtaju ila tankahin, Yusef continued, his voice soft now, almost intimate. La yahtaju ila nurumin, la yahtaju ila technologia. Huwa kamil kama huwa. Hal tastati'u an taqula hadha an nafsika. Water needs no refinement. It needs no upgrades. It needs no technology. It is perfect as it is. Can you say this about yourself? Linus's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his wineglass but stopped halfway. The question hung in the air like smoke. Finally, Yusef turned back to Edward, and his eyes, those clear, calm eyes, seemed to see through every defense, every rationalization, every wall Edward had built around himself over decades of ruthless success. Wa anta, Sayyid Ashford, Yusef said, his voice now carrying the weight of judgment and compassion equally mixed. Anta tazunnu anna kulli shay'in lahu thaman. والحقيقة هي أن كل شيء ذو قامة له ثمن إلا الأشياء التي تهمم حقا. And you, Mr. Ashford, you think everything has a price. And the truth is that everything of value has a price, except the things that truly matter. Edward felt something cold move through him, something that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Had hal maru, Yusef said, holding the bottle higher. يذكرك بمن كنت. الولد الذي كان يعتذر لأبيه الفحم. الرجل الذي وعد زوجته بعالمين لا يعرف فاهي العدد بل أواتف. This water reminds you of who you were, the boy who respected his laborer father, the man who promised his wife a world measured not in numbers, but in moments. Edward's father had been a coal miner in Pennsylvania. Dead now 15 years, Edward had paid for the most expensive funeral, the finest casket, but hadn't cried, hadn't allowed himself to cry. Al-mas'ala laysat hal tastati'u an tashtar hadha al-ma, Yusef said, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. Yet somehow everyone in the restaurant could hear him perfectly. Al-mas'ala hiya hal la tazalu tadhakkuru kayfiyat ash-shukr. The question is not whether you can buy this water. The question is, do you still remember how to be grateful? He set the bottle down gently on the white tablecloth, in the exact center of the table, equidistant from all three men. The restaurant was utterly silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work. Drawn by the strange tableau unfolding in the dining room, Edward stared at the bottle. Just plastic and water, common, ordinary, available everywhere for almost nothing. But as he looked at it now, he saw his father's blackened hands washing in cold water after a shift. He saw his wife, Catherine, on their wedding day, crying tears of joy that he'd wiped away with wet fingers. He saw his daughter, Rebecca. God, when was the last time he'd called Rebecca? Splashing in a pool at their summer house, calling for him to watch, always calling for him to watch while he answered emails on his phone. all of it connected by this. By water. By the thing so fundamental he'd stopped seeing it. What did he say? Edward asked, his voice cracking. Musala, please. What did he say? Musala wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He said, Musala paused, struggling. He said that water was there before we were. That it's the first thing we taste as babies and the last thing we ask for when dying. He said, another pause. He said we can buy 1,000 bottles, but that doesn't mean our hearts know how to value even one. That's not all he said, Linus pressed, his voice unusually gentle. What else? He spoke to each of us, Musala said quietly. Things he couldn't have known. About my son. About your addiction to complexity. About Edward's father and his forgotten promises. That's impossible, Edward said, but his voice lacked conviction. He's just a street vendor. He doesn't know us, doesn't he? Yusef asked, speaking English again for the first time since the challenge began. Or do all men of great wealth share the same sorrows, the same forgettings, the same holes in their souls that no amount of money has ever filled? Edward stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His hands were shaking. I can't. He looked at his friends, these men he'd known for years, competed with, respected, envied, and supported. Musala was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it. Linus had removed his glasses and was staring at the bottle of water with an expression of profound loss. You didn't sell me the water, Edward said to Yusuf, his voice trembling. You told me things about my life. That's not what I asked for. No, Yusuf agreed. You asked me to convince you to buy the water, to make you want it. And I did. Look at you now. You want it more than anything in this restaurant. You want it more than the wine you've been drinking, more than the meal you ordered. You want it because, for the first time in decades, you understand what water really is. It's just water, Edward whispered. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Yes, Yusuf said gently, it is just water. And that is everything. Edward sank back into his chair. He picked up the bottle with hands that trembled like a man with palsy. The plastic felt cheap, the weight negligible. Inside, the water was clear and still. He unscrewed the cap slowly, listening to the soft pop of the seal breaking, the tiny hiss of air escaping. Then he raised the bottle to his lips and drank. It tasted like water. Just water. But as it flowed down his throat, cool and clean and necessary, Edward thought about his father emerging from the mines, about Catherine's tears on their wedding day, about Rebecca calling for him to watch, always calling for him to watch while he looked elsewhere. And for the first time since he was a child, since before he learned that the world could be bought and sold, conquered and possessed, Edward Ashford tasted what he was drinking. The bottle slipped from his nerveless fingers, hitting the table with a soft thud. Water sloshed but didn't spill. And then Edward Ashford, billionaire, captain of industry, master of the universe, put his head in his hands and wept, not quietly, not with dignity, but with great wrenching sobs that shook his entire frame, sounds torn from some deep place he'd locked away so long ago he'd forgotten it existed. Around them, the restaurant remained frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. They were witnesses to something too raw, too real to interrupt. Linus reached across the table and gripped Edward's shoulder. Saying nothing, offering only presence, Musala stood, walked around the table and pulled Edward into an embrace, something they'd never done in all their years of friendship. I know, Musala whispered. I know, brother. I know. Yusef watched them for a long moment, his weathered face expressionless. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out 2 more bottles of water. He set one in front of Linus, one in front of Musala. For you, he said simply. No charge. No transaction. Just water. For men who've forgotten how to drink. He began to gather his things, preparing to leave. Wait, Edward gasped out, looking up with red eyes, his face wet and raw. The money. I owe you. You won the challenge, did I? Yusef asked. What did I win, Mr. Ashford? The $100,000. I promised. I always keep my promises. Even as he said it, Edward heard the irony. He kept his financial promises while breaking every other kind. Yusef shook his head slowly. I do not want your money, but you earned it. The challenge was never about money, Yusef interrupted gently. Not for me. You needed to buy something you couldn't understand. And now you have. But what you bought cannot be purchased with money. I don't understand, Edward said. Though part of him did, part of him understood perfectly. You will, Yusef said. In time, when you call your daughter, when you visit your father's grave and finally say goodbye, when you look at your wife and remember why you married her, you will understand what you bought tonight. He shouldered his canvas bag, preparing to leave. Wait, Musala said, standing. You knew? About my son, about how did you know? I didn't know, Yusef replied. I only spoke truth, and truth finds its target. The wealthy all suffer the same wounds, my friend. You are not as unique as you believe. Who are you? Linus asked, his analytical mind still trying to categorize, to understand, to reduce this experience to data. Yusef smiled for the first time, a sad, knowing smile. I am a man who sells water to people dying of thirst. Some thirst for water. Some thirst for other things. But all are thirsty, and most do not even know it. He turned to leave, and this time no one stopped him. But at the entrance to the restaurant he paused and looked back. His eyes found Edward's across the crowded room. Mr. Ashford, he called out, his accented voice carrying clearly. You asked if everything has a price. Here is my answer. Yes, everything has a price. But the things worth having cannot be bought. They can only be received. And you can only receive them when you open your hands and stop grasping. Then Yusef walked out into the rain, his white hair briefly visible through the glass doors, before he disappeared into the night, carrying his bag of water to other tables, other people, other thirsts that money could never quench. The three men sat in silence for a long time. Around them the restaurant slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Silverware clinked against china. But at their table the three most powerful men in the room sat staring at bottles of water, like they contained the secrets of the universe. I need to call Rashid, Musala said finally, his voice hoarse. He's probably awake. He never sleeps before midnight. I'm going to call him and tell him. He paused. I don't know what I'm going to tell him, but I'm going to call. He pulled out his phone, stood, and walked toward the windows where he could see the rain and the city, and maybe, just maybe, a path back to his son. Linus picked up his bottle of water, studying it like it was a new piece of technology he'd never encountered. I've been building intelligence into everything, he said quietly. Smart homes, smart cars, smart cities, everything connected, everything optimized, everything enhanced. But I can't remember the last time I just sat, just existed without upgrading the moment. What will you do? Edward asked. I don't know, Linus admitted. Maybe nothing for a while. Maybe that's the point. Edward looked at his own bottle, the one he'd drunk from, now half empty, or half full. How long had it been since he'd seen things that way? I have a daughter, he said. Rebecca, she's 23, graduated from Yale last year. I attended the ceremony. I don't remember a single moment of it because I was on a conference call the entire time. He laughed, but it came out as something closer to a sob. She gave a speech. My daughter gave a speech at her graduation from Yale, and I don't know what she said. You could call her, Linus suggested. Ask her about it. She won't answer, Edward said. She hasn't answered my calls in 4 months. Not since I missed her birthday again for the 3rd year in a row. Then go to her, Linus said. Show up. Stand at her door and wait. Be the father who shows up instead of the father who sends a check. Edward nodded slowly. Yes, I could do that. Hassan the maitre d' approached hesitantly. Mr. Ashford, your meals are ready. Shall I cancel them? Edward said. Sir, cancel the meals. All of them. And Hassan? Yes, sir. That man who was just here, Yusef. If he ever comes back, you let him in. You seat him at the best table. You treat him like royalty. Do you understand? Of course, sir, but... No buts. Just do it. Edward pulled out his wallet and handed Hassan $500 bills. That's for the cancelled meals and for your discretion. What happened here tonight doesn't leave this room. Hassan pocketed the money smoothly. Of course, sir. Nothing happened here tonight, but they all knew that wasn't true. Everything had happened here tonight. Edward stood feeling unsteady on his feet, despite having drunk less than his usual amount. I'm going home. Catherine will be asleep, but I'm going to wake her up. We're going to talk, really talk. And tomorrow I'm flying to Boston to see Rebecca. Good, Linus said. That's good. Musala returned from his call, his face transformed, still lined, still showing his age, but somehow lighter, younger. I talked to Rashid for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Do you know the longest conversation we've had in the past year was 90 seconds? And tonight we talked for 20 minutes. About nothing. About everything. About how much I love him and how sorry I am. The three men looked at each other, and something passed between them. Understanding, solidarity, the shared recognition of having been broken, and maybe, just maybe, having found the first piece of how to heal. Same time next month? Linus asked. Same time, Edward confirmed, but somewhere different. Somewhere less, he gestured at the opulence surrounding them. Somewhere with better water, Musala suggested with a weak smile. Despite everything, they laughed. It felt good to laugh. It felt human. They left the Celestial Pearl separately, each heading to their own cars, their own lives, their own reckonings. But as Edward stood in the rain waiting for his driver, he tilted his face up to the sky and let the water run down his cheeks, mixing with the tears that were still falling. Rain. Just rain. Just water falling from the sky, free, available to everyone from the wealthiest CEO to the poorest street vendor. And in that moment, Edward Ashford understood what Yusuf had been trying to teach him, that some things, the important things, the things that made life worth living, couldn't be bought because they were already given freely to anyone willing to receive them. You just had to remember how to open your hands. 3 months later, the coffee shop on Amsterdam Avenue was nothing special. No chandeliers, no maître d', no reservation list. Just good coffee, comfortable chairs and windows that let in the afternoon light. Edward sat at a corner table, a simple mug of black coffee in front of him. Across from him sat Rebecca, his daughter, still wary but present. They'd been meeting here once a week for the past 2 months, slowly, painfully rebuilding something that had crumbled from neglect. "So Mom says you've actually been home for dinner 3 nights this week," Rebecca said, a hint of cautious optimism in her voice. "That's got to be some kind of record." 4, actually, Edward corrected with a small smile. "I made it 4 nights. Though I'll admit, Thursday's dinner was takeout because I burned the salmon." Rebecca laughed, a real laugh, not the polite, distant sound she'd been making for years. "You cooking? Dad, the world really is ending." "Maybe the old world is," Edward said quietly. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching people pass by on the street. Students, families, professionals, street vendors with their carts. Among them, Edward thought he saw a flash of white hair, a canvas bag. But when he looked closer, the figure was gone. He'd been looking for Yusuf for 3 months. Searched the area around the Celestial Pearl, asked other restaurants, even hired a private investigator. No one had seen him. No one knew him. It was as if he'd materialized that one night to deliver his message, and then vanished back into the city's anonymous millions. Or perhaps he'd never been real at all. Edward still wasn't sure which possibility unsettled him more. "Dad?" Rebecca's voice pulled him back. "You okay? You kind of zoned out there." "Sorry," Edward said. "I'm here. I'm present. I'm listening." And he was. For the first time in years, he truly was. Rebecca studied him with eyes that reminded him painfully of her mother. "You've changed. I don't know how else to say it. But you have. It's like you're actually here now, not just physically present while your mind is somewhere else." "I am here," Edward confirmed, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out how." "What happened?" Rebecca asked. "Mom won't tell me. She just says you had an experience that woke you up. But what does that even mean?" Edward considered how to answer. "How do you explain that a street vendor selling water shattered your entire worldview? That a conversation you couldn't understand taught you everything you needed to know? I met someone," he said finally. "An old man who taught me that I'd been asking the wrong questions my whole life." "What questions were you asking? How much? How do I get it? What's it worth? What will it cost?" Edward wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, feeling its warmth. "I thought life was about acquisition, about building, earning, possessing, controlling. I thought if I could just get enough money, enough success, enough power, then everything would be okay. And now? Now I think the real questions are different. Not how much, but how grateful. Not what's it worth, but what does it mean? Not what will it cost, but What will I lose if I keep living this way? Rebecca reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. I'm proud of you, Dad. I know that's weird to say to your father, but I am. It takes courage to change. Edward felt his eyes burning. He cried so easily now, after decades of keeping everything locked down. I'm just sorry it took me so long. I missed so much of your life. You did, Rebecca agreed, and her honesty was a gift. But you're here now. That's what matters. You showed up. Through the window, Edward watched a young mother help her daughter navigate a puddle left by that morning's rain. The little girl jumped in it instead, splashing water everywhere, and the mother laughed instead of scolding. Such a small moment. Such an ordinary moment. 6 months ago, Edward wouldn't have noticed it at all. I love you, Rebecca, he said. I don't say it enough, I don't show it enough, but I do. I love you more than any deal I've ever closed, any company I've ever built, any amount of money I've ever made. I know, Dad, Rebecca said softly. I think I always knew. You just forgot to remember it yourself. They finished their coffee as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold. And when they left, Edward hugged his daughter, really hugged her, holding on like she was precious, which she was, before she headed back to her apartment in Brooklyn. Edward walked home instead of calling his driver. It was 40 blocks, but the day was clear, and he wanted to feel the city around him, wanted to be part of it instead of above it. As he walked, he passed a bodega with bottles of water lined up in the window. He stopped, studying them. Dasani, Poland Spring, Fiji, Smart Water, all different brands, all claiming to be special, pure, enhanced, superior. But Youssef had been selling generic water in unmarked bottles, because the brand didn't matter, the packaging didn't matter. The marketing didn't matter. Water was water. And water was everything, and if you understood that, you understood what Youssef had been trying to teach them. Edward bought a bottle, the cheapest one, generic brand, 99 cents, and carried it with him as he walked. He didn't drink it, he just held it, a reminder of that night, of what he'd learned, of who he was trying to become. At home, Catherine was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She looked up when he entered, and her face transformed with a smile that reminded him why he'd married her 30 years ago. You're early, she said. I'm exactly on time, Edward replied. I promised I'd be home by 6, it's 5:45. My God, who are you and what have you done with my husband? Catherine teased, but her eyes were serious, hopeful, still not quite believing this change would last. Edward set the bottle of water on the counter and pulled her into his arms. I'm your husband, I'm just trying to remember how to be him properly. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other while the evening light faded outside, and, for the first time in longer than either could remember, Edward was fully present, not checking his phone, not thinking about tomorrow's meetings, not planning his next acquisition. Just there, just alive, just grateful. That night, after dinner, a meal they'd cooked together, talking and laughing and burning the vegetables slightly, Edward went up to his study. But instead of opening his laptop to check markets and emails, he pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. He began to write, Dear Youssef, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if you're real, but I need to write it anyway. You asked me if everything had a price. I said yes, I was wrong. Some things can't be bought because they're already given. I just had to learn how to receive them. He paused, staring at the words, then continued. I called my daughter. I'm having dinner with my wife. I visited my father's grave and finally cried. I donated half my wealth to causes that actually matter. Clean water initiatives, mostly. It seemed appropriate. I still don't know what you said that night. Musala translated some of it, but he said some things were better left in Arabic, that the meaning lived in the language itself. I think I understand now. Some truths transcend translation. Some lessons can only be learned in languages we don't speak. Thank you for teaching me how to be thirsty again. Thank you for showing me water. He signed his name and folded the letter carefully. He had no address to send it to, no way to reach Youssef. But that wasn't the point. The letter was for him as much as for its intended recipient. A declaration of change, a promise to himself, a map of who he was trying to become. Edward placed the letter in his desk drawer, next to the cheap bottle of water he'd bought that afternoon. His two treasures, his reminders. Then he turned off the light and went downstairs to where Catherine was reading by the fireplace. He sat beside her, not speaking, just being present, and when she reached over to hold his hand, he held back, and they sat together in the quiet, while the fire crackled and the city hummed its eternal song outside. And somewhere in that city, perhaps in another restaurant or on another corner, an old man with white hair and a canvas bag full of water was teaching someone else the same lesson, that everything has a price, yes, but the things worth having can only be received, never bought. That you can be dying of thirst surrounded by an ocean, that the question isn't whether you can afford the water, the question is whether you still remember how to drink. 5 years later, the Celestial Pearl had been sold and converted into a community center. Edward had bought it himself, then donated it to a non-profit that served the neighborhood's immigrant population. The chandeliers were gone, replaced with practical lighting. The expensive tables had been replaced with folding ones, where families gathered for ESL classes and job training. But Edward still came here once a month, not to the community center itself, but to the corner outside it where he'd set up something he'd been thinking about for years, a water station. Free, clean water available to anyone who wanted it. No questions asked. No transaction required. He stood there on a cool October evening, 5 years to the day since that dinner that changed everything, filling cups and bottles for whoever needed them. Some people thanked him, some didn't. It didn't matter. Musala joined him, as he did every month. His son Rashid came too now, a young man of 22 studying to be a social worker. They had rebuilt their relationship slowly, painfully, but thoroughly. Now they worked side by side, father and son, serving water to strangers. Linus arrived. Last, as always, his company's now focused on sustainable technology and accessible computing. He'd simplified his life dramatically, sold 2 of his 4 houses, drove an electric car instead of a fleet of luxury vehicles, and spent his weekends teaching coding to underprivileged kids. 5 years, Linus said, picking up a stack of cups. Has it really been 5 years? 5 years since we stopped being quite so stupid, Musala replied with a smile. Not that we've figured it all out, but we're less stupid than we were. Progress, Edward agreed. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, filling cups, exchanging brief conversations with the people they served. A mother with 3 children, a construction worker heading home after a long shift, a student rushing to evening classes, an elderly woman who smiled and blessed them in a language none of them understood. As the evening deepened and the crowd thinned, Edward found himself scanning the faces of passers-by, as he always did. Still looking, still hoping, and then he saw him, an old man with white hair now more stooped than before, more weathered, but unmistakably him. Yusuf carried the same canvas bag, though it looked more worn now, and he walked with a slight limp he hadn't had before. Edward's breath caught. Yusuf! The old man looked up and his eyes, those clear, calm eyes, met Edward's. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been pleasure, or might have been satisfaction. Mr. Ashford, Yusuf said, approaching the water station. Or should I call you Edward now? I think perhaps we are past formalities. You're real, Edward breathed. I wasn't sure. I looked for you. For months I looked for you. I know, Yusuf said simply. I saw you looking. But you never, why didn't you? Because you weren't ready, Yusuf interrupted gently. You needed time to understand what I taught you, without me standing there waiting for gratitude or recognition. The lesson had to be yours, not mine. Edward nodded, understanding. And now? Now 5 years have passed. Now you stand here giving water freely instead of buying it proudly. Now you understand the difference. Yusuf gestured to the station, to Musala and Linus and Rashid working beside Edward. You learned. All of you learned, Musala had frozen, staring at Yusuf. It's you. Hello, my friend, Yusuf said warmly. Your son is well? He looks strong. He is well, Musala confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Because of you. Because of what you taught me. No, Yusuf corrected. Because of what you chose to do with what you learned. I only held up a mirror. You decided to look. Linus approached, studying Yusuf with the same analytical intensity he brought to everything. I've wondered about you. Who you are. How you knew those things? What you really said that night? Would it change anything if you knew? Yusef asked. Linus thought about it, then shook his head. No, the mystery is part of the lesson, isn't it? Not everything needs to be quantified and understood. Wise, Yusef said, nodding approvingly. You have learned well. He set down his canvas bag and pulled out a bottle of water, unmarked, generic, identical to the ones Edward and his friends were distributing. May I? He asked, gesturing to the station. Of course, Edward said. Please. Yusef filled his bottle slowly, deliberately, treating the simple act with the same reverence he'd shown that night in the restaurant. When it was full, he held it up to the streetlight, and the light passed through it, creating small dancing prisms on the pavement. Al-ma'u la yazalu ma'an, he said softly in Arabic. Wa hadha la yazalu kulli shay. Water is still water. And this is still everything. What does that mean? Edward asked. The Arabic. What did you just say? Yusef smiled. That same sad, knowing smile from 5 years ago. It means water remains water, and that remains everything. It means you can spend 5 years giving it away and it will still teach you, still humble you, still remind you of what matters. He took a long drink, then capped the bottle. It also means you have learned the lesson but not finished it. Learning is never finished. You will spend the rest of your lives understanding what I taught you in 20 minutes. Will you stay? Musala asked. Join us? We have so much to ask you. No, Yusef said. I have other tables to visit, other thirsty people to serve. But I wanted to see you, to witness what you became, to know that the water I offered you 5 years ago is still flowing through your lives. He picked up his canvas bag, preparing to leave. Wait, Edward said urgently. One question. Just one, please, Yusef paused. One question, that night. Did you know it would work? That I would understand? Yusef's eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. Mr. Ashford, Edward, every person I have ever spoken to has understood, because I don't speak to minds. I speak to hearts, and hearts know only one language, truth. He began to walk away, his white hair catching the streetlight, his limp somehow dignified rather than diminished. Yusef, Edward called out. Thank you. For everything. For changing my life. The old man turned back one last time. I didn't change your life, Edward. I reminded you of what it was supposed to be. There's a difference. Then he disappeared into the evening crowd, a white-haired man with a bag of water, walking among the thousands of other stories unfolding in the city night. Edward stood watching until he could no longer distinguish Yusef from any other person on the street. Then he turned back to his friends, to the water station, to the work that had become his purpose. He's right, you know, Linus said quietly. We're still learning. Still figuring it out. Good, Edward replied, picking up a cup to fill for the next person. I'd hate to think I had nothing left to understand. They worked until late in the evening, until the crowds thinned to nothing, until the city settled into its nighttime rhythm. And when they finally packed up the station, Edward kept one bottle of water aside, the one Yusef had filled. He carried it home like treasure. That night, sitting in his study with the bottle on his desk beside that 5-year-old letter he'd never sent, Edward pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began to write again. Dear Yusef, you came back. I don't know if you'll come back again, but if you do, I want you to know. I'm still learning. We all are. Still figuring out how to receive instead of take, how to be grateful instead of acquisitive, how to see value without assigning price. It's harder than I thought it would be. Some days I slip. Some days I catch myself counting things that shouldn't be counted, pricing things that shouldn't be priced. But then I remember water. I remember that night. I remember your voice speaking truth in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow comprehended perfectly. And I start again. Thank you for the reminder. Thank you for still carrying that bag. Thank you for teaching a world that forgot how to be thirsty. He signed the letter, folded it and placed it in the drawer with the first one. 2 letters. 2 bottles of water, 5 years of learning, and tomorrow he would return to the water station. And the day after. And the day after that, because the lesson wasn't finished, would never be finished, because water kept flowing, kept teaching, kept reminding him that everything had a price except the things that mattered, and those things, love, presence, gratitude, connection, meaning, could only be received with open hands. Edward looked at the bottle of water on his desk, at the clear liquid inside catching the lamplight, creating small prisms that danced across his walls. Al-ma'u la yazalu ma'an, he whispered, trying out the Arabic sounds, mangling the pronunciation but meaning it with every fibre of his being. Wa hadha la yazalu kulli shay. Water is still water, and that is still everything. In the silence of his study, with the city humming outside and his family sleeping peacefully in rooms nearby, Edward Ashford, once a man who thought he could buy the world, now a man learning to receive it as a gift, finally understood what Yusuf had been trying to teach him all along. You could sell someone water in a language they didn't understand, but only if they were ready to hear what the water had been saying all along, and the water said, "You are already wealthy. You just forgot how to notice." The water said, "Everything you need has always been here. You just stopped looking." The water said, "The question isn't, can you afford me? The question is, are you thirsty enough to drink?" And after 5 years of learning, Edward finally was. He unscrewed the cap of Yusuf's bottle and took a slow, deliberate drink. It tasted like water. Just water, and it was perfect.